So, hi, good morning, or good very early morning, depending on what coast you're on. Good afternoon for anyone who's joining us from over the pond. My name is Michele Endean. I work with NEMPN as their treasurer. I have worked in museums, in exhibit design, and strategic planning in the past. Work in kind of contract museum work on occasion. So I'm here today to tell you a little bit about kind of revamping your resume for the job hunt. I've got a couple of plugs before and then after the session. Maybe my first one before we dive in will be if you are going to take any of the advice from today and update your resume or plan to in the next couple of weeks for the job hunt and would like a review of that, we are actually, as NEMPN, hosting a resume review in April on April 17th. So if you'd like to participate in that, we'd love to have you. I'll drop details into the chat at the end of our session, but keep an eye out for that. Additionally, we've got a couple of other great sessions today as part of Museum Workers Advocacy Day, as well as tomorrow, especially focused on things like being an independent museum professional that's really relevant to this conversation as well. So feel free to drop questions in chat as we go. Also, just jump off mute if you've got questions. Happy to answer those as we're going through this. I will share the link to the deck and then just like a summary PDF of the resources after we're done. So you'll have all of those as well. And without any further ado, let me go ahead and get started. Let's share my screen. And hopefully you guys can see my screen. Fantastic. So we're going to start off with maybe just a couple of quick notes around the job landscape. And this probably isn't new information to you, but as you've started looking, or if you're getting back into looking for a new role in the museum field, a couple of general notes, especially hopefully to try to buoy your spirits. The industry is very, very saturated. There's a lot of people coming out of undergraduate and graduate degrees in museum studies, exhibit design, and then a bunch of adjacent degrees in various forms of art or history or anthropology that want to pursue roles in museums. Realistically, right, there likely aren't enough roles in the museum landscape, even at small and mid-sized museums, to have everyone have a role. When we've got a lot of folks who have been in the industry for a very long time, and the turnover in roles is generally pretty low, especially at senior levels. So that means that the second bullet is even more important, where your network really, really matters when you're applying to jobs. Having someone be able to give a good word for you either before or during the process, or make sure that your resume makes it out of the online submission into the pile that they're reviewing for a first round or a screener is really, really critical. This also is really important to make sure that folks are giving you guidance in your network on where roles are likely to open up and or where roles may be a good fit for you, or the institution may not be a good fit for you, and you can kind of keep it out of your search as you're starting to look, so you're not wasting time on roles or institutions that are not a great fit. If you're sitting there saying, that's fabulous, Michele, but like, how do I grow my network? What does that mean in the museum field? NEMPN is an amazing resource for that, as well as the other partners that we've got for Museum Workers Advocacy Day. So IMP, our Canada EMP group, as well as museumexperts.org. So as you're looking for roles, feel free to join these resources, join these networks, and put yourself out there. Introduce yourself to folks in the online forums. Ask for guidance and help. I don't think I've ever seen a question go through the NEMPN Facebook group that doesn't have at least a handful of people chime in. And a lot of them may have the same kinds of questions that you do, either about the search or about open roles and opportunities. So use all of those resources to maximize your opportunity and potential to get into the field or to change roles in the field once you've joined us. I'm going to pause. Comments, questions before I continue? Okay. So let's jump in. We're going to start with resumes. I've got just a very short slide about cover letters as well, but we want to focus today on thinking about resume writing and revamping that resume. It's go ahead and pull it out, dust it off. If you haven't seen your resume in weeks, months, years, maybe, this is the time to go ahead and give that a revamp. And we're going to just talk a little bit about kind of some of that 101 reminder stuff if you haven't touched your resume recently. First things first, the difference between a resume and a CV. If you're applying to roles in the United States, you're going to want to use a resume or a resume format versus something closer to a CV. If you're applying to roles outside of the US, so typically across Europe, the UK, and Canada, they lean towards closer to a CV style. However, when you're looking at a resume, how is that different from a CV? Your resume is typically going to be more concise and more tailored to the role that you're applying to, as opposed to a CV, which is a more robust, kind of exhaustive list of everything you've ever done, including things like speaking engagements, publications. If you've taught at all, it may even have details about what courses you've taken while you were in undergrad or graduate school. So CVs can be very, very long. Even a basic CV ends up being a couple of pages. So when you're applying to roles in the US and in the museum field, you'll want to lean towards a resume, which is that really tailored look at yourself as is relevant to the current. A couple of general notes on kind of formatting and writing your resume. It may go out without saying, but we want to make sure that as we're doing that, we keep it really organized and concise. Our general rule of thumb is if you've been in work in some form or fashion in a full-time role for, let's call it 5 to 10 years, that's where you may see yourself shifting over to 2 pages for your resume. If you've been in the workforce for less than 5 years, you should be able to get everything in your resume on a single page. And I recognize that's right, like it's closer to that kind of like front back versus just front of a page. Not that you're going to turn this into anyone in person nowadays, but we want to make sure that we're really focusing on what's important, which is why we like to make sure that we're thinking about 1 versus 2 pages and how we're filling those up. We also want to make sure that our general organization of our resume is consistent. So that can mean that you choose a 1-column format, right, where everything is kind of listed top to bottom on your page. Maybe you've got dates right aligned, your institution name left aligned, and some details on bullets and things in between. It can also mean that you choose something like a pair of columns. So you've got a column of something on one side and maybe a smaller column on the right side, maybe with things like skills, etc. Whatever you choose is great. Let your content of your resume help determine what your formatting should look like. But when I'm talking about these formats, we want to make sure that we're consistent across the entire resume for our formatting. So if we've chosen to go ahead and do something like a 2-column format, we want to make sure that we're consistent across both of our columns for our formatting. We want to make sure, right, that our titles and our headers, the way that we use bullets, etc., looks similar across the whole resume. Similarly, again, you may be like, of course, Michelle, but we want to do a grammar check and make sure that it's easy to read. It can be very easy as you're writing your own resume to read over errors, because your brain is automatically correcting them, thinking that whatever you're reading on the page is actually there. That may not be the case. So what I'd recommend is as you're finishing up your resume, or even maybe as you're starting a first draft and you've kind of put a bunch of new things on your resume, send that to a friend, someone who's not seen your resume recently, and have them do a quick just grammar read over. May not even be reading for content, but have them read it for grammar to make any edits and changes for you. Also make sure that when we're talking about easy to read, we want to make sure that it's actually physically easy to read. That means to be cognizant of things like white space. So this slide, for example, right, is like 70% white space and just has a handful of bullets, lots of space between them. It's very clear what the title is versus the content. We want to make sure that that's the same way on your resume, so that not everything is size 11 font or size 8 font if it gets really small. And that makes it really, really challenging as a resume reviewer to read. Your resume will go into, likely, an automated system as you submit it online. They typically call them ATS systems. And those are going to parse through your resume and kind of feed it into the system in the back end and try to make an educated guess on what's the institution name or your employer name, what's your experience with that employer, what do the dates look like. So that's fine if you have a lot of stuff on your resume and the computer is reading it. But when you have your actual potential hiring manager or manager pull that resume up and read through it before they get on the phone with you, we want to make sure that they can read it as well. So just be really thoughtful about, as we're putting stuff on the page, if you would look at the page and say, wow, that looks really overwhelming, or that would be really hard to read, maybe that's likely going to be the same for your potential manager or hiring manager. And we may want to either cut stuff off of it, or be thoughtful about, oh, am I starting to maybe bleed into a space where I can think about a second page. Just a couple more notes here about kind of basics. When a lot of folks may see growth in a single institution or employer, this is amazing, right? When we see ourselves grow in roles at a particular employer, we want to be able to show that off. You say, okay, that's great. How do I do that without having like 6 or 8 different kind of employer roles on my resume? What we'd recommend is that you have something like a institution name or your employer, and then have just a little bit of a change in formatting to note your job title underneath that, and then detail that job description in bullets with those dates for that particular role. And then similarly, leave that same formatting for your role title and use that again for your new role or your old role at the same institution, so that when someone looks at that resume, they can see that there's kind of a block that they say, oh, Michele worked at this institution in 2 different roles for these dates. So I can see that she grew while she was at that institution in the different things that she took on or in the different kinds of roles that she tried out while she was there. You may be saying, this all sounds lovely. Maybe my current resume is in Word. That's amazing. I love Word for a resume, so don't be scared of using things like Word or Google Docs for your resume. If you want to design your resume, that's really specific to your job context. So if you work in things like exhibit design, I would maybe expect your resume to be built in a Canva or an Adobe adjacent product, so that you've got something that's got a little bit more of your kind of design aesthetic in the actual resume itself. But typically, that basic kind of Word or Google Doc formatted resume is fantastic and helps us get a really clear sense of who you are without a lot of additional things going on to potentially distract us from the content. The last note I'll make here before I pause and then we jump into kind of details about content on resumes is social media links. There is nothing wrong with including a link to your LinkedIn, your email, potentially even a portfolio website or a portfolio Instagram, depending on what your role you're looking for is, or if you managed things like the social media at your last institution, you probably want to include a link to that on your resume. My note on this is make sure your social media links are professional, which means that they are clean, they are concise, and they are clear. So you may say, Michele, I don't know what that means. If you've gone to your LinkedIn, your own LinkedIn profile, and you've seen kind of the content after the / in the URL, it likely has maybe your first letter of your first name and your last name with a bunch of additional characters behind it. You can actually change that in LinkedIn. You can change what your short URL is to be whatever your heart desires. And I would encourage that before you go and write a new resume or as you're updating it, to make sure that those kinds of links where you have the ability to make them clear and concise are clear, and you clean them up so that they don't have a huge hanging list of additional numbers and letters that don't mean anything to you or to your potential employer. All right. I know that's been a lot on kind of resume formatting. Let me pause. Any questions, any comments? Feel free to drop them in chat as well if you're like, I'm not coming off mute. No, thank you.
Yeah, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Hi, good morning. So my name's Emma. I'm a Canadian, and I have permission to work in the US.
Amazing.
So when I'm applying to American jobs, um, a lot of the time it isn't necessarily clear if they want the resume or the cover letter. Sometimes it specifies, sometimes it doesn't. So I kind of have a resume cover letter hybrid that I send to my American applications or the American job postings. In the grand scheme of things, how important is it in the US to distinguish between the resume style that you emphasized versus the CV that is more popular in other places?
Great questions. Maybe I've heard a couple in there. So let me address kind of your primary question first, which is resume versus CV in US. Um, I would typically recommend erring towards closer to that resume format in the US, though it'll depend on how much experience you have. How long have you been full-time working, whether it's in the museum industry or not?
Uh, it's been about ten or so years on and off with working and volunteering.
Okay, so then I would recommend you have something that looks like a resume, but may contain a little bit more information like a CV. I say that because you've got enough at work experience full time that you can have 2 pages in a resume, which may allow you to get closer to some of your kind of CV style content on there. I would also tailor it based on the kinds of roles you're applying for. So if you're applying for roles in things that are education based, I would be including if you have things like, hey, I've hosted presentations or been a professional speaker at something or spoke at this conference, et cetera, or built content and formatting for, an education concept at my own museum, include those in their own section, right? So you can call those out independent of something like employment, the way that you would on a CV, and include those in that like longer form resume. In terms of your kind of other embedded question around in kind of integrating something like a cover letter into your resume, we're going to talk about that
Oh,
next.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean cover letter. I meant CV.
Oh,
I
okay.
haven't had my coffee yet. I'm still trying to wake up.
No, it's
I'm
okay.
sorry about that.
No. I know it's early. That's totally fine. So then, yes, I would err towards a longer form resume. And as you're building that, again, like feel free to join our session. It's going to be mid-April for resume review. We'd love to have anyone who wants to join us at the NEMPN session. I'll drop details in the chat and we'll email them to everyone after as well. But that would be a great opportunity as well to get someone with likely a US background with eyes on your content or your resume to say, hey, is that kind of what my US employer would be looking for? Does that answer your question?
It does, yes. Thank
Okay,
you.
great. Any other questions here before we talk a little bit more about kind of what goes on the resume? We've talked about what it like looks like, but what goes into it?
Hi, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Ray Harada. Nice to meet you. Um, so you can save this question later if that's more appropriate. But I got education in the U.S., but I worked in Japan for 10 years. My internship was in the U.S. And then I have background of like 10 years experience in Japan. My resume looks like a lot of um, unfamiliar terms or organizations because that was I my experience in Japan. So, do you have any recommendations for me who I'm looking for a job in the U.S. That you know it like that experience is more yeah it could be transferable in the U.S. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a great question. When we're thinking about our experience, to your comment, you've got a lot of experience, and it may not be one for one with what your institution is looking for. You've actually given me a really good lead into my next slide. So I'm going to swap slides, and we can kind of talk about your situation in this context. Um, when you are looking for a role, a new role, maybe even upgrade to your current role at your current institution, it's really about aligning your bullet points and your descriptions of your jobs to what the new employer is looking for, as opposed to saying, ooh, I'm going to leave that off entirely because maybe it's not a 1-for-1 for what my new person is looking for. Great examples, right? And I've done resume reviews and kind of education and upskilling for even high school and college students when they're looking to go to college or looking for that first internship or job. And they say, you know, Michele, I've only got experience being a lifeguard or working for this student club as kind of a leader in that student club on campus. I don't have any immediately transferable experience to my new employer. One, if your employer requires that you have every single skill that they put on their job posting day one, they're probably lying generally about the kind of candidate they think they're going to get and what they think they're going to be able to pay them. One. So if you think you meet half the criteria for a job posting, I would apply to it, frankly, because there's likely some flexibility in what they've put on there, and there's likely a lot of things that they would like for that role that they haven't listed in the actual criteria and experience. Two, it's also important to think about, right, to your comment, transferable skills. So what are we thinking about from that time when you were a lifeguard or when that time when you were managing a student club? Were you doing, let's call it general stakeholder management? Were you doing partner identification when you were looking for someone to print your newsletter or to host an event off campus? Were you doing conflict resolution when you were working as a lifeguard? Were you doing kind of safety training and upskilling as a lifeguard? There's a lot of those things that are actually really transferable to the other work you may be doing. You're just not thinking of them in that broader context of what your future employer may want. So looking at maybe bullets like 3 or 4 through 6, kind of the bottom half on here, when you're thinking about your previous roles, think about how you align those experiences with what your new employer is looking for, right? They've listed at least a handful of things on their new job posting about what they want, what kind of people management skills they're looking for. Maybe you have to interface or talk to guests and visitors at the new institution. All of those things are things you probably have relevant and relatable experience to. So make sure you're wording those experiences in a way that they're not 1-for-1 matching, but leaning closer towards the language that your new institution or hopefully your new role is using in their job posting. And that'll help draw the more clear line on the 1-for-1 for the role and skills that you have. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, good. A couple of other quick notes. So we've talked a little bit about kind of general basics for formatting. We're going to see some of that called out here, but let me give like the quick overview on what sections do I have on my resume. I'm realizing now I don't have a slide on that, which is entirely my fault. So basics, contact information. When we talk about contact information though, you'll see that in that first bullet. We want to be really careful about what we include so we don't get disqualified. And there's 2 kinds of things that could get us disqualified. One is if we include too much personal information, especially if you're applying for a job outside of the US, and frankly, even some roles in the US are moving this way. They don't want photos of you, right? They don't want you to be putting things like your pronouns in your resume. They frankly want nothing more than like your name and maybe a phone number in your email. And that's it, right? That's all that's important. The reason I would encourage you to not put in an address is unless you work in the exact city that you're applying to or within a reasonable driving distance already, you're going to likely disqualify yourself by accident if you put your current address or your current location on your resume for a role that's not nearby. So I think Emma, you had mentioned you live in Canada, you may be looking for roles in the US. I would not be including information that you are Canadian on your resume. I would not be including information that you live in Canada on your resume. That may immediately disqualify you. There's likely going to be a bunch of other questions in their online application or portal asking if you have the right to work somewhere, asking where you live, etc. But I wouldn't include that on your resume because you don't want to introduce potential bias against yourself by accident when you submit that information. So contact details, right? That probably should be right at the top. Make sure that your name is like clear. If you have a name that you prefer to go by instead of your professional, like formal name that's on your birth certificate or on your, driver's license and your passport, etc., include that as well. So I may go by something else other than Michele, and I would put that on my resume so that they know what to call me, right? So include that up at the top. The other sections you're going to want to include are some version of experience. That could be inclusive of work experience, unpaid volunteer experience, leadership experience for other things you're doing. Does not matter, but a general experience category, right, which would include those kind of roles, the people that you're working for or with, and then dates along with bullets. You're going to want to include some kind of skills section. I've got a note down there at the very bottom, but we're going to talk a little bit about skills in the context of what is a skill? How do I have that help tell more of my story on my resume? And then you're going to likely want to include some version of an education section. That is essentially just the checkbox and proof for an employer that you indeed have some version of education, right? That could be from the US, from not the US, from the country you're applying to, from the country you're not, or outside of the country you're applying to. But it's for them to say, hey, have they been formally trained in anything, which is essentially what your education is. Those are kind of it for the basics. Like those are the only sections that you have to have, which is contact info, experience, skills, and education. You can augment that with whatever additional sections make sense for the role you're applying to. So maybe you want a section on awards, or have you worked on exhibitions that have received awards? You should probably have that somewhere on your resume. Have you worked in publication? Have you published anything, right? Is that part of your role, or has that been part of your role in the past? Amazing. Have a publication section with links out to your publications. Do you potentially speak additional languages that would be very helpful in context of your new role? Great, put that on your resume. These are all areas that you could add, but again, you're going to want to tailor those based on what you're applying to. That's more to my kind of second bullet here around demonstrating that you're a different type of candidate, which is that you're thinking about what you can deliver to your institution or to this role in the context of what you know about yourself. So, for example, I have worked in medical devices, in technology consulting, in strategy consulting, in museums work, and in kind of like formalized large-scale nonprofits. Those are all very, very different kinds of work. And not all of them are relevant when I'm looking for a new role. So I'm going to tailor what I'm telling my new employer I've been doing so that they understand what is important or what I think is important for them to know about prior to the new role. Apologies, I have a guest who's decided to join us for our session today. I see a note in the chat from Shannon. Thank you. Would you put experience above skills or skills first? I've heard preference for both, but most recently skills at the top. Great question. I always err towards put what you think is most important for your new employer to see at the top. Full stop. That's why you put your name at the very top, right? That could be skills. If you don't have, maybe you don't have formal work experience, like maybe you want to start a new kind of career in museums. You're like, I've worked in education, I've worked in curatorial, etc., and I want to move to exhibition design work. Okay, maybe you have no experience one-to-one that says I've worked in exhibition design, but that doesn't disqualify you. Maybe you have a lot of skills and background in design and architecture that would make you a really good candidate for that work, or in talking to the public through some of your education work. That's what I would want to see at the very top, because that's going to be me as an employer's immediate way to say, oh, look, they are likely qualified for this work, or they could be a really good candidate for this work. Does that answer your question, Shannon? So unfortunately, it's not like I don't have a yes, skills at the top, no skills at the top. It's a what is the right fit for the role or the kind of role. Okay, great. That leads me into maybe my next note here on bullet 3, which is quality over quantity, for 2 reasons. If I'm looking at your resume, and this is a general across the board from anyone I've talked to that's a hiring manager, etc., and I see that you have 18 different roles or even 6 different roles on your resume, all of which you've worked at for a year, year and a half, or 6 months, and I see maybe 1 or 2 bullets describing the work you're doing there and that's it, but there's a lot of roles with like very little description, that's going to make me a little nervous as an employer because I don't have a really good sense of what you did in any of those places. And I see that you worked at a lot of places. So I'm like, ooh, that could be good, but I don't have enough an idea of what they did there to really know if that's a value add for my organization and for this role. However, if you pick out maybe 2 or 3 of those experiences that are most relevant, and you could put just the organization with dates if you want to note that you worked somewhere but don't have a description for it. But give me bigger sets of bullets, right? 2 or 3 bullets, 4 or 5 bullets for some of these things that you can tell me more about what you did, right? Because for a lot of employers, especially as you're going through these online automated systems, they're using keywords. They've put a bunch of keywords into their back end for their system, and that's what they're filtering through when they're looking at the bullets that you use to describe your work, the roles that you use to, or the words that you use to describe your job title and role, and your institution name. So as you're doing those things, make sure that we're thinking about, hey, I want to make sure I'm also thinking about keywords. And that's where the job description comes in, right? If I look at the job description, what's in that description likely is a handful, if not a lot of the keywords that they're going to use to filter through. So make sure that as I'm describing those roles and the quality of work I've delivered and the kinds of things I've delivered in those roles, that I'm using that job description as a guide. My last note here, and Ray, I see you've got a question in the chat, is actionable. If you can, and I recognize not every role allows you to do this, right? But if you can include numbers in your job description bullets, this can be as simple as created STEM programming for insert whatever program title you have at your organization that served this many constituents or visitors over 8 weeks, right? Or give a guesstimate that served dozens, hundreds, whatever it may be. It could be as broad as describing numbers for your overall organization. Maybe your organization is really small as a museum. It doesn't have ways to measure anything more than like the number of people who visit on an annual basis, right? That's fine. Tell them, hey, I do, all of the front of house education and tours for an organization that annually serves 50,000 visitors. That's still an amazing number and sounds really, really impressive when I have it in context, right? So make sure, even if you've got little numbers, right? The number being bigger doesn't make it more impressive. Any number that you can give shows that you understand the value of noting and thinking about impact, because that's what the metrics are, right? You've probably heard that before when you're doing resume reviews and resume updates, but like when people tell you to include numbers, they tell you to include numbers because it's about recognizing that your work has an impact and how big is that impact. So when you're thinking about your roles, anytime that you can drop a number in there or go dig a number up from your current job, maybe drop it into your resume. Employers love that, and they like to be able to ask about that in more detail. Let me see. I've got a question from Ray, and then I'll talk maybe about the last bullet on here before we do a brief stopover at cover letters. So I've got a question here. My LinkedIn has a photo of me and a she, her after my name. Is it okay looking for a job and putting that link on my resume? Yes, absolutely. Mine's the same way. I've got my pronouns on my LinkedIn. I've got a photo, the same photo I've used for years now on my LinkedIn. That's all fine. Having an online presence that is reflective of who you are and what you think is important is completely fine. The reason I would suggest not include, and it's totally okay to then link to that on your resume. My like second link is my LinkedIn on my resume. It's like name, email, LinkedIn. That's all totally great. The reason I would encourage not to put your pronouns and your photo on your resume itself is that what I don't want to have happen is that your employer, and this is as a general note, this is typically how it goes if you haven't done hiring before or if you haven't hired anybody, is I get a stack of candidates from my hiring manager or whoever's managing the actual like HR, et cetera, the job posting. That may be me, right? but I have a stack of resumes from candidates that applied that were shortlisted, that I'm like, oh, of the 100 resumes I got, these are the top 15 based on whatever criteria we're using. I will then look through those resumes themselves, giving those maybe like a minute a piece, if they're lucky, on resumes to kind of skim them and be like, oh yeah, they seem like someone I'd be willing to have a screener phone call with, or what have you. And then I flip to the next resume. I will only likely go into someone's LinkedIn once they've made it past the first round of hiring. So if they have that kind of screener where they do the like, hey, tell me about yourself. Let me make sure your resume matches who you actually are. Where do you live? Are you willing to take this like pay area, etc. If you make it past that kind of role screener, that's likely when I'm going to open up your LinkedIn. I'm likely not going to look at your LinkedIn until you've made it into that first like real round of robust questioning, which is why you don't want to include that photo or those pronouns on your resume, because I don't want to maybe have me as a hiring manager sort you out by accident, or sometimes unfortunately by intention, but hopefully by accident instead, because of something I saw on your resume where my subconscious is telling me, oh, well, like, I didn't really want a woman in this role. Or, oh, whatever their photo is, I have an immediate reaction to. We don't want that for you, right? We don't want to put ourselves at risk for that. So I always take all that off unless you get a very explicit ask to have that stuff on there. Hopefully that answers your question, Ray. Yes, good for LinkedIn, good to have everything on your LinkedIn, just not on your resume. Last thing on here, wording skills to augment experience. So we talked about those kind of 4 big sections on your resume. We also want to be sure that our sections don't have that much overlap on our resume, right? If I have a bunch of things listed in skills that I've already talked about at length in my bullets on my resume, I'm kind of wasting my skills section, right? Like I could put a lot of other stuff there because I'm talking about something that already exists. Skills, I like to think of as, again, that keyword bank. So maybe I've written all of my bullet descriptions to be really very descriptive. They have a lot of metrics in them. They've got very, very clear definition of exactly what I was doing. But because of that, they don't have a lot of keywords, right? Maybe I talk about my work in a way that means that I haven't hit a lot of the things that I'm seeing as keywords in their job description. This is where I would use my skills section and say, ooh, what kind of skills, which they probably literally have listed in the job description, are they looking for? And then are any of those things that I can provide them? And then I will type those into my skills section. So think of them as complementary to each other instead of competing with each other, right? The goal is to get a picture of who you are with your resume, so that skills section should be another like slice in the pie, as opposed to being overlapping really heavily with your experience. Okay, there's been a lot of stuff that I've delivered now on resumes. I'm going to pause. Any questions on resumes, content, how to stand out, what you put on there, before we do a really brief stop at cover letters and then kind of close out? All right, I've got a couple of questions in chat. I've got one that says, I've had some trouble understanding the purpose of a skills section or how best to incorporate it. Would you say a skills section has in a sense replaced the summary section? No. So I've seen people continue to use the summary section. We're going to talk about that again in just a second in context of cover letters. When I think about a summary section, I think about 2 sentences, right? Like think about it as not quite Twitter length, but like close, where I've got 100 words to describe who I am and why my background is important for this role, right? Think about it as like, if I could give them a cover letter in 2 sentences, that would be your summary section. However, your skills section is intended to capture things that you may not explicitly say on your resume. So for example, I'm going to go back to our exhibition design person. maybe in exhibition design, you've got a lot of things in your bullets about the kinds of exhibits you've built, the size of those exhibits, how many people they have go through them regularly, maybe if they generated a bunch of extra money, if you built a special exhibit, or if you stayed under budget. Great thing to call out on resumes, like, oh, look, I can deliver projects on time and under budget. But I may have skills as an exhibit designer that I don't put in my bullets, right? I can work in a variety of softwares. Maybe I have a background in interior design. Maybe I have some certifications from like LEED, etc. Those are the kind of things that fit really, really nicely in skills, right? So skills can be anything from, are there software tools that you work with that you have no reason to mention in your bullets, but that you want to make sure someone knows you can use? Those go in skills. Do you have maybe languages? Maybe you don't have a lot of language background, but you have a couple that you may know in addition to your native language. That could fit in skills as well. Things like what I'm going to lovingly call soft skills. Hate the word set, but we're going to call them that, right? Because if you've got like people management skills, conflict resolution, stakeholder management, vendor discussions, that kind of stuff fits really nicely in a skills section. Again, especially if I don't explicitly have a place to call it out in my resume. So if you're thinking of, I would recommend if you've got sections on your resume where you're like, Michele, I have no idea what that's supposed to look like. If you're not, one, in the stuff I'm gonna send you guys at the end of this, we've got a couple of good examples of resumes that we're gonna send to you so you can see what some of that looks like. But two, literally go online, Google resume plus museum plus skills, and just scroll through the image results that you get of other people's resumes in the sector, and you'll see some of the kinds of things that you may want to think about including as skills. I've got another question in the chat from Emily. Do you have a visual on how skills and experience go together? I do. I don't have it in this deck. Again, I'll send that to you guys as kind of the wrap up for this with those resume examples. But what I would typically think of is always write all of your experience first. At least I always write all my experience first. And then then write your skills section. And I basically do a review and say, okay, were there bullets that I cut, right? Maybe I normally write everything and then cut it down to fit onto a page or 2 pages. So I typically start by writing every bullet, and then I delete a bunch of them or highlight the ones I'm going to keep, and then say, ooh, maybe there was something that in a deleted bullet would go in a skills section. That could be good, because then I still maybe get part of what my bullet was going to have, but I don't have to have the whole backstory. Hopefully that's helpful, Emily. And again, I'll send you guys some examples so you can kind of see what that looks like. I know it's really hard to maybe visualize without the example. Any other questions on resumes? Okay, let's then take a really quick stop by cover letters. I'm not going to exhaust this because cover letters themselves can be exhausting to write. I completely get it. My general rule of thumb for cover letters. So these are a holdover from when you would go in person, literally, to submit your resume, and you'd have like a little cover letter. They are actually a holdover from faxes. I know, insane. I don't know if anyone on the phone has ever sent a fax in real life, but they used to have a cover sheet on the fax where you would basically be like, this is for insert person's name, and then a short description of what the thing was, so that they knew what was coming after that cover sheet. That's essentially what a cover letter is for a resume. So the intention is that it's supposed to give the reviewer a little bit more context on who you are and why you're applying for that role, right? This is stuff that they're going to get out of you in the interview, but this is supposed to be the introduction to you and why, as opposed to the what, which is all of your resume. So a couple of notes. One, again, grammar. Always have someone check yours for grammar. I'm the worst offender of this, so that's why I put this on all these slides. Two, short. It does not have to be an essay. Frankly, it shouldn't be an essay. If I'm going to pick up a cover letter and read it, again, it's probably because you've gotten to the kind of a formal interview section of the hiring process. But two, I'm going to have again, a minute maybe to read through your cover letter. So it should be a couple of paragraphs at most. If you're going to include any specific examples in your cover letter of why you're the best candidate for this job, remember that star analogy, which you've likely used in interviewing before, but go ahead and use that star analogy again in giving that context in your cover letter, which is setting up the situation. So what was happening? Talking about the task, what were you told to do? The action, what did you do? And the result, what happened as a result of what you did. And use that kind of formula if you're going to give any examples. But generally, right, cover letters are supposed to be a, why do I want this job? That could include things like that star analogy. So maybe you give a specific example that says, look at how amazing I am. I've done this job before. I just wanted it at a different institution, or I want to do it at a higher level. It could be a, I am so aligned with the mission and vision and values of this new institution. That's why this resonates with me. That's why I want to move to this organization. It could be also a great place to explain, hey, in my case, I come from consulting. That's weird. Why would I want to move into museums? And then helping draw the line between what my life in consulting looked like and how that's going to help their museum, right? So this is the place for you to tell them why you're special and why they should hire you, essentially, before you get into the actual interview process. My last note on this before I pause again for questions on cover letters is I have a love-hate relationship with cover letters. So I would say I use them about 30% of the time for the roles that I am most excited about. I don't write a cover letter for every single resume I send in or every single job I apply to. Should I? Maybe. But I use them for cases where I really want to showcase how excited I am about a particular role and or why I am applying to that role with my background, because maybe my background sounds weird for the role that I'm applying to. So with that, is my other note on cover letters. I'm going to pause. Questions on cover letters before I do our concluding slide on like just general takeaways.
This isn't a question, but it is a comment that I do a lot of hiring for entry level positions. And I think I just want to stress that it is such a good point about the alignment between like how you see your experience fitting into this entry level position, because you could think like, why am I going to write a cover letter for this entry level position? Like, it's a waste of time. I get it. I've been there. But I get a lot of applications where people have no alignment to the entry level position. And I'm like, okay, I could take a risk on this person, right? I see that there are some things that I see that align, but what does this person see that aligns? Like, why did they think that their unique background is great for this entry level position? It makes a huge difference, because I get like hundreds of applications to this entry level position. And because it's entry level, you might not have any background in this field that you're applying for. That's totally fine. But like, make a case for why any experience you do have fits well. So in those instances, it can be helpful either to have a cover letter or really make that skill section on your resume stand out as like an argument, not just a statement of what you've done, but why you think that aligns with the job.
It's a great call out. And thank you, as another person who is in hiring or as a hiring manager. It's like, yes, like it's great for telling me why you, right? Because your resume is telling me what you can do, but your cover letter should be telling me why here, why this job for you. Emily, I see your note in the chat. Yes, I've got cover letter examples for you too. Fear not. All of that's coming in a package at the end of this, so you guys will get all of that. If no other questions about cover letters, let me kind of go to my wrap-up slide, and I've got a couple of notes for you guys. So maybe one note here just on tailoring. We've already talked about this at length, but I just wanted to put a couple additional resources on here before the wrap-up. As you're tailoring for your search, you're probably looking across every job board for museums. There's a lot of them. We're not going to list them here. You would die about how many there are, but look for your local, regional, and national museum organizations. They all have job boards. Keep an eye on those. If you have specific institutions you're interested in, keep an eye on their job board specifically, because a lot of museum job boards in particular require you to pay to list on them, which is not great. So that means that you have to go directly to the source. A lot of them cross-post on LinkedIn and Indeed as well. So keep an eye on those. As you're researching for your job, keep an eye on LinkedIn. This is a great place to network and connect with people. It's also a great place to see if an institution's like, hey, we're about to have a huge expansion. We're going to build a new building. We're going to launch a whole new exhibit. They may be hiring to help do those things. So keep an eye out for that. If you have not been on Glassdoor, Glassdoor is your resource for all things backend about a company. It's verified. Only employees of those companies can post. So they can post things like salaries. They can post reviews of the workplace environment. They may post notes about their interview questions. So if you're not on Glassdoor, go check out Glassdoor. And the IRS Form 990 for any museum that is a registered nonprofit in the United States has to fill out a Form 990 every year, which has to list their top 20 paid employees with their salaries. So I would encourage, especially maybe as you get along in the hiring process, again, that's a whole different session, but like check out their 990 about the organization, because you'll also get a sense of like, can they afford you? Are they even paying their people today? Is it worth your time to apply? If there's a role that you're excited about that doesn't have a salary listed. We've talked a little bit about LinkedIn already as well. I wanted to put a note on here again as a reference. Make sure that your LinkedIn at least is listing all of your existing roles that you may be putting onto a resume. There are some employers that will go through and do just a sanity check and be like, hey, are all their roles listed on their LinkedIn? And if there's missing roles between your resume and your LinkedIn, they may be like, that's weird. Your LinkedIn is also a great place to link to something like a CV, Emma, and or portfolios, again, depending on the kind of role that you're looking for, because that's a place that you can link at the very top of your LinkedIn and kind of like a pinned area, almost essentially, links out to those CVs, those portfolios, specific articles and things if you've been featured or done any work that's been featured and that kind of stuff. And it's a great place to essentially have a highlights reel of yourself accessible to the public on your LinkedIn. So if you're not going to apply with something like a portfolio or a CV, but you want people to be able to access it, drop it on your LinkedIn. All right, my last set of thoughts. And I know I'm trying to wrap this up so that you guys still have a couple of minutes at the end for questions. As a general reminder, there are no rules that are hard and fast across resumes, which is why I've given you some very general guidance today, but have not provided you with like, this is the template that you have to follow for museum resumes, because that doesn't exist. It will change industry to industry. It may change organization to organization, or even in the industry, depending on the size of the organization. As always, we mentioned at the top, this is a very, very competitive market, generally, for jobs, especially in museums. So if not museums, you have amazing transferable skills. All of you do. I'm convinced of it. I haven't even met any of you, and I already know you already have transferable skills. So look for other roles outside of museums if you want to do that kind of work. Think about zoos. Think about teaching roles. Think about galleries. Look at adjunct professorships in your local area. A lot of the time they're part-time, so that gives you some flexibility. Look at roles in technology, especially museum adjacent technology. If you've used any system in your museum that maybe was a back-end curatorial system or an archiving system, et cetera, or even an education system, that company that supplies that technology is probably hiring people that used the system before. So like, go look there. Marketing roles are great for transferable skills from nonprofits and museums, and look in general nonprofits as well. Some really, like, especially large nonprofits in the US and globally are typically always hiring. Also make sure to explore other ways of employment. You could be an independent museum professional. I'm plugging our Museum Workers Advocacy Day IMP sessions. We've got one later today and one tomorrow. So keep an eye out for those if you're interested in other more non-traditional ways to be employed. And make sure, again, always tailor your resume, even for a LinkedIn Easy Apply. When I apply to stuff, I have 4 already pre-tailored resumes based on the areas or job descriptions I'm looking for. And that way I don't give a generic resume to every single job I apply to. The resume has already been pre-tailored for that kind of role. My last note is don't give all your good stories away in your resume. Right? We like to keep it a little bit vague, maybe, because you've got to keep some exciting stuff for the interview. Don't give all your good stuff away up front, or you're not going to have anything amazing to say in the interview that they haven't already heard from you. With that, I see a couple of questions in chat. Let me answer those, and then I'll pause and we'll do kind of final wrap up. I think I see a note from Sheridan. It's okay for positions to be on your LinkedIn that are missing on your resume. Yes. If you have to cut a non-related role from your resume to make it fit, that's fine, but absolutely list everything on your LinkedIn. Yes, that's exactly true, Sheridan. So when we're talking about matching, quote unquote, make sure that your LinkedIn includes everything from your resume, if not more. Your LinkedIn can be basically your like permanent long form resume. That's what I treat it like. It's got everything. But again, to Sheridan's comment in the chat, I cut stuff off my resume all the time because it's either not relevant, not applicable, it's too old, what have you. And that's totally fine. But you want to make sure that anything that you're putting on your resume is on your LinkedIn, if you have a LinkedIn. All right, let me pause. I know we're almost at time, but I'm happy to stick around for a couple of extra minutes to answer questions from anybody. If you've got to drop because you're like, dude, this was already cutting into my workday, totally fine. Would love to thank you for coming. We're going to send out an email with all of the resources, including the deck from today, a quick 2-pager on kind of the highlights, and some resources for everybody. But any other questions or comments before I close this out? All right, I don't see anyone struggling to come off mute. So with that, I'm going to close our session out for today.